At my in-laws' 40th wedding anniversary celebration, they stood before 300 of Atlanta high society elite and announced that the whole family was going to Monaco for a 2-week vacation. Everyone was thrilled, and the room erupted in applause. I smiled and turned to my husband asking what time our flight was leaving. My father-in-law leaned into the microphone so the entire ballroom could hear, and replied that of course I did not know because I was not part of the family. He told me I could stay behind and take care of all my sister-in-law's children while they enjoyed the Mediterranean. What I did next left everyone in complete shock and cost them their entire empire. My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old, and I am the woman who quietly dismantled the most powerful family in Atlanta. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and tried to destroy your life. Section 1. 1,500 words. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, I learned early on that independence was the greatest form of security. I earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university and built a career as a forensic data analyst and software developer. I eventually founded my own artificial intelligence auditing firm that specializes in tracking illicit financial networks. My company serves federal agencies and massive hedge funds. It is a highly lucrative and intensely private career. I kept my business out of the public eye because in my line of work, anonymity is an asset. When I met Julian Sterling, I thought I had found a partner who respected my drive. Julian was the heir to Sterling Commercial Real Estate, a massive empire that owned half of the premium office spaces in the city. He was charming and attentive, and he made me feel like I belonged. We married 3 years ago, but the illusion of our perfect union faded almost immediately. The Sterling family was the epitome of the African-American elite in Atlanta. They cared only about generational wealth legacy and maintaining a flawless public image. My parents-in-law, Richard Sr. and Vivian, made it abundantly clear that my working-class background was a permanent stain on their family tree. Vivian was a proud member of a historic and highly exclusive sorority. She spent her days attending charity luncheons and judging anyone who did not meet her impossible standards. She constantly reminded me that I did not attend a historically black college or university of her choosing, and therefore lacked the proper pedigree to be a true Sterling. My sister-in-law, Camille, and her husband, Derek, were equally insufferable. They lived a life of sheer extravagance completely funded by the corporate credit cards of the family business. Derek fancied himself a brilliant real estate broker, but everyone knew he was simply riding the coattails of his father-in-law. Despite their constant microaggressions, I maintained a polite and respectful distance. I kept my head down and focused on my software company, secretly growing my personal wealth while allowing Julian to play the role of the primary provider. I thought my patience and grace would eventually earn their respect. I was completely wrong. The truth of their cruelty was fully exposed at the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton during Richard and Vivian Sterling 40th wedding anniversary gala. The room was a sea of designer gowns, tailored tuxedos, and glittering diamonds. The air smelled of expensive perfume and imported champagne. 300 of the most influential people in the city were gathered to celebrate a marriage that was as much a business merger as it was a romantic partnership. I stood beside Julian near the front of the stage, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress. Julian was busy shaking hands with politicians and business magnates, barely acknowledging my presence. I had spent the entire evening being introduced to people who looked at me with thinly veiled pity. The whispers in the elite circles were always the same. They wondered why the handsome and wealthy Julian Sterling had settled for a woman with no family name and no societal standing. I ignored the whispers and focused on surviving the night. About 2 hours into the reception, Richard Sr. walked up to the stage. The band stopped playing, and the room fell into a respectful silence. Richard adjusted his tuxedo jacket and tapped the microphone. He gave a long and boastful speech about the legacy of the Sterling family, about how he and Vivian had built an empire from the ground up, and how their bloodline represented the pinnacle of success in Atlanta. He spoke about family loyalty and the importance of preserving their wealth for future generations. Then his face broke into a wide, theatrical smile. To celebrate 40 years of absolute perfection, he announced into the microphone, "I have a special surprise. This weekend, the entire Sterling family is flying on our private Gulfstream jet to Monaco. We have rented a private villa overlooking the sea for 2 weeks of pure celebration." The ballroom erupted in enthusiastic applause. Camille and Derek cheered loudly, raising their champagne glasses in the air. Vivian dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, soaking in the adoration of her peers. I turned to Julian, feeling a brief spark of excitement. A trip to Monaco sounded like the perfect opportunity for us to disconnect from work and spend some quality time together. I leaned in close to Julian and asked him what time we needed to head to the private airstrip on Friday. Before Julian could answer, Richard Sr. locked eyes with me from the stage. The room was still quiet enough that his voice echoed clearly through the sound system. He leaned into the microphone and his tone was dripping with condescending amusement. "Oh, Naomi," he said, projecting his voice, so that all 300 guests could hear every single syllable. "Of course you do not know the flight details. You are not part of this family trip. The invitation is for the Sterling bloodline only. You can stay behind at the estate and take care of Camille and Derek children. I have already printed out a schedule for you. Enjoy your time as the family babysitter." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the grand ballroom. 300 pairs of eyes shifted from the stage directly to me. I could feel the collective gasp of the crowd. The humiliation was immediate and crushing. The patriarch of the family had just publicly reduced his daughter-in-law to the status of an unpaid servant in front of the most powerful people in the city. I looked at Julian, fully expecting my husband to step forward to take the microphone and defend his wife. I waited for him to declare that if I was not going, he was not going either. Instead, Julian looked down at his glass of bourbon, shifted his weight awkwardly, and let out a nervous laugh. He turned to me and shrugged his shoulders. "Come on, Naomi," he muttered loud enough for the people around us to hear. "You know you do not fit in with the Monaco crowd anyway. You do not even own the right clothes for the yacht clubs. Just stay home and watch the kids. It will be easier for everyone." Vivian stepped off the stage and glided over to where I was standing. She wore a custom emerald green gown that swept the floor. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a thick binder, dropping it heavily onto the cocktail table in front of me. "Here are the dietary restrictions for your nieces and nephews," she said with a chilling smile. "Try not to scratch the hardwood floors while we are gone." The surrounding guests began to murmur and chuckle. The cruelty was not an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to put me in my place. They wanted me to break down. They wanted me to cry and storm out of the ballroom, proving their narrative that I was an emotional, unstable, and low-class woman who could not handle the pressures of high society. But I did not cry. My tears had dried up a long time ago. The hurt and betrayal I felt in that moment instantly transformed into a cold and absolute clarity. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my drink. I simply picked up the heavy binder, looked Vivian directly in the eyes, and offered a perfectly polite smile. "I understand completely," I said, my voice steady and smooth. "I wish you all a truly unforgettable trip." I placed my champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray and turned my back on the Sterling family. I walked out of the ballroom with my head held high, my posture straight, and my dignity fully intact. I could feel their disappointed stares burning into my back. They had wanted a spectacle, but I gave them nothing but ice. I knew my worth, and I knew that responding with anger would only give them the satisfaction they craved. I decided in that moment that my marriage was over. But I had absolutely no idea that the public humiliation I just endured was only the beginning of a much darker and more sinister conspiracy. The hallway outside the grand ballroom was quiet, providing a stark contrast to the buzzing humiliation I had just left behind. Thick velvet carpets muffled my footsteps as I made my way toward the VIP suites on the second floor of the club. As the wife of the heir apparent, I had been given a key card to a private dressing room to store my coat and belongings. My only goal was to gather my things, call a private car service, and return to my own secure condominium that I had purchased secretly before the wedding. I needed a sanctuary away from the Sterling estate to process the end of my marriage. As I approached the heavy oak door of the VIP suite, I noticed it was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm yellow light spilled out into the dim corridor. I reached out to push the door open, but stopped abruptly when I heard a familiar voice coming from inside. It was Julian. He was not alone. "I promise, baby, it is all going perfectly according to plan," Julian was saying, his voice low and intimate. "Just one more week and we will never have to hide again." I held my breath and pressed my back against the wall beside the doorframe, peering cautiously through the narrow opening. Julian was standing in the center of the luxurious dressing room, with his arms wrapped tightly around a woman. It was Lauren. Lauren was Julian's childhood friend, the daughter of a powerful local politician, and the woman Vivian constantly praised as the ideal match for her son. Lauren was everything I was not in their eyes. She had the right pedigree, the right family connections, and the right social circle. Lauren tilted her head back and smiled up at my husband. She raised her left hand, and the light from the chandelier caught the massive diamond ring sparkling on her ring finger. It was easily a 5-carat stone, custom designed and undeniably expensive. "Are you absolutely certain we can announce this in Monaco?" Lauren asked, tracing the lapel of Julian's tuxedo jacket. "I am tired of sneaking around hotels and pretending we are just friends. I want everyone to know that I am going to be the next Mrs. Sterling." Julian kissed her forehead and pulled her closer. "You will be," he promised. "My father's announcement tonight was just the first step. By the time we land in Europe, the divorce papers will already be filed and served. My parents have arranged an exclusive dinner at the Monte Carlo casino to officially announce our engagement to our inner circle. Monaco is going to be our celebration." My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I forced my body to remain perfectly still. My husband of 3 years was not just having a casual affair, he was engaged to another woman. The entire Sterling family knew about it. The public humiliation downstairs had not been a spontaneous act of cruelty by my father-in-law. It had been a coordinated effort to push me out of the picture while they prepared to welcome Lauren into the fold. They had planned this for months, maybe even years. I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out my smartphone. My hands were remarkably steady given the magnitude of the betrayal I was witnessing. I opened the voice recording application and pressed the red button, holding the phone close to the crack in the door. I needed documentation. In the world of forensic data analytics, evidence is the only currency that matters. "I cannot believe she actually stood there and took it." Lauren laughed, a cruel and mocking sound that echoed in the quiet room. "When your dad told her to stay home and babysit, I thought she was going to burst into tears. She is so pathetic, Julian. Why did you ever marry someone with zero backbone?" Julian let out a heavy sigh and poured himself a drink from the minibar. "You know why I married her, Lauren. We needed someone naive and trusting, someone with a perfect financial background and no powerful family to protect her. My father insisted on it. Naomi was the perfect candidate for the corporate restructuring. She never asked questions about the paperwork I brought home for her to sign. She was so desperate to please my parents that she would sign anything to prove her loyalty." I frowned in the darkness of the hallway. Corporate restructuring. I mentally reviewed every document Julian had ever asked me to sign. Mostly, they were tax returns, joint banking agreements, and standard marital financial disclosures. I always read them thoroughly, but there was never anything out of the ordinary. What was he talking about? Lauren took a sip from Julian's glass. "Well, I am just glad this charade is almost over," she said. "Your mother has already started planning our wedding. She wants a spring ceremony at the Botanical Gardens. We are going to have a guest list of 500 people. It will be the social event of the decade." Julian smiled and kissed her deeply. "It will be everything you ever wanted," he promised. "We just have to get through the next few days. Once the federal agents move in on Naomi, we will be safely out of the country, and the entire mess will be out of our hands." The phrase "federal agents" sent a literal shockwave of ice through my veins. My professional instincts kicked into overdrive, overriding any emotional pain caused by the infidelity. Federal agents did not get involved in simple divorce proceedings. Federal agents meant federal crimes. I pressed my phone closer to the door, making sure the microphone was capturing every single word. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to remain shallow and silent. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with terrifying speed. The sudden engagement, the trip to Monaco, the blatant attempt to ensure I stayed behind in Atlanta. The Sterling family was not just discarding a daughter-in-law they deemed unworthy. They were setting me up to take the fall for something massive. I had spent my entire career tracking down white-collar criminals and corporate fraudsters. Now I realized with horrifying clarity that I had been sleeping next to one for 3 years. Inside the VIP suite, the door connecting to the adjacent room opened, and Derek, my brother-in-law, stepped in holding a thick manila folder. Derek was the supposed real estate genius of the family, but I had always suspected his deals were more about aggressive networking than actual business acumen. He looked around the room and smirked at Julian and Lauren. "Wrap it up, lovebirds," Derek said, tossing the folder onto the dressing table. "We need to go over the exit strategy one last time before the party ends. Richard Sr. wants to make sure there are no loose ends." Lauren stepped back from Julian and crossed her arms. "Is everything secure, Derek? I do not want any unexpected legal trouble ruining our trip to Monaco." Derek laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Everything is perfectly secure, Lauren. Naomi's signature is locked in on every single document. She is the sole guarantor and acting chief executive of Sterling Ventures, LLC. As far as the government is concerned, she is the sole mastermind behind the entire operation." I covered my mouth with my free hand, suppressing a gasp. Sterling Ventures, LLC was a holding company I had never heard of. I had certainly never signed any documents making me a guarantor, let alone a chief executive. Julian rubbed the back of his neck, looking slightly nervous. "Are you sure the signatures will hold up under scrutiny, Derek? If the feds realize those documents were forged, the whole plan collapses." "They will hold up," Derek assured him, tapping the manila folder. We lifted her electronic signature from the joint mortgage application and the digital tax software she uses. We embedded it seamlessly into the articles of incorporation and the offshore transfer authorizations. It looks completely authentic. By the time she realizes what happened, it will be too late. Lauren smiled, her eyes gleaming with malice. "So exactly how much trouble is she in? I want to know exactly what we are leaving her to deal with while we are sipping champagne on the yacht." Derek leaned against the vanity mirror, looking exceptionally proud of himself. "Over the past 3 years, Richard Sr. and I have used Sterling Ventures LLC to funnel approximately $12 million in unreported income and phantom real estate assets into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. We needed a clean entity to absorb the tax liabilities and shield the main family corporation from an audit. Naomi has a spotless credit history and zero criminal record. She was the perfect fall guy." Julian nodded, pacing the room. "The IRS and the FBI have been sniffing around the commercial real estate sector in Atlanta for months. My father knew an indictment was coming. That is why we are leaving for Monaco now. On Tuesday morning, the feds will raid the Sterling Ventures office. They will find a massive paper trail of tax fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering, all pointing directly to Naomi. She will be facing at least 20 years in federal prison," Derek added cheerfully. "And because she is legally responsible for the $12 million debt, the government will seize all her personal assets, freeze her bank accounts, and ruin her completely. The Sterling family name remains untouched. We claim we had no idea our rogue daughter-in-law was running a criminal enterprise behind our backs. We play the victims, she takes the cage." I stopped recording and slowly lowered my phone. The sheer magnitude of their evil was difficult to process. They had deliberately selected me, manipulated me into marriage, and smiled in my face for 3 years, all while meticulously plotting to destroy my life and throw me in a federal penitentiary. They looked down on me because of my working-class background, yet they relied on my clean record to save their own corrupt empire. I quietly stepped away from the door and moved swiftly down the velvet-lined corridor, making sure to stay in the blind spots of the security cameras. I needed to get out of the building immediately. I had less than 48 hours before the federal agencies made their move. The Sterling family thought they had trapped a naive, helpless victim who would crumble under the weight of an IRS investigation. They had no idea that they had just handed $12 million worth of fraudulent data directly into the hands of a senior forensic data auditor. I exited the club through the rear service doors, slipping unnoticed into the cool night air of Atlanta. I hailed a private car service and gave the driver the address to my secure condominium. As the car sped through the city's streets, my mind raced analyzing the data parameters and constructing a counteroffensive. I remembered a crucial detail. 3 months ago, Julian had complained about his home office computer running slowly. I had offered to fix it for him. While repairing his operating system, I had quietly installed a highly encrypted background data mirroring program onto his local network. I did it initially just out of habit to ensure our joint financial files were safely backed up. I had completely forgotten about the hidden partition on my own encrypted server that was quietly receiving weekly updates from Julian hard drive. Everything they had done, every forged document, every offshore account number, every email between Richard Sr. and Derek, it was all sitting on my private server, waiting to be analyzed. They thought they had left me with nothing but a binder of babysitting instructions and a one-way ticket to prison. Instead, they had given me the exact weapon I needed to execute a complete and total financial annihilation. I arrived at my condominium and locked the heavy steel door behind me. The space was sleek, minimalist, and filled with high-end computing equipment. I walked straight to my primary workstation and powered on the massive monitors. The screens illuminated the dark room with a cool blue glow. I pulled up the hidden partition containing Julian mirrored network data and cracked my knuckles. I had 48 hours to reverse engineer a $12 million money laundering scheme. I was going to dissect the Sterling Empire line by line, dollar by dollar. I was not just going to clear my name, I was going to buy their debt, seize their assets, and orchestrate a takedown so brutal that the elite circles of Atlanta would whisper about it for decades. The Sterling family wanted to fly to Monaco. I was going to make sure their final destination was exactly where they belonged. The glow of the monitors illuminated my face as the decryption sequence initiated. My luxury condominium, located on the penthouse floor of a high-rise in Midtown Atlanta, was a fortress of solitude and technology. Julian and his elitist family believed I lived entirely off the meager allowance he provided from the Sterling corporate accounts. They believed my days were spent organizing his dry cleaning and managing his social calendar. They had absolutely no idea that this property alone was worth more than the entire liquid cash reserve of their allegedly billion-dollar empire. I am not a low-level administrative clerk. I am the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of Apex Financial Forensics. My company builds highly specialized artificial intelligence algorithms designed specifically to hunt down dirty money. My clients are not socialites or real estate brokers. My clients are federal intelligence agencies, international banking conglomerates, and private hedge funds seeking to uncover massive corporate fraud. I built my firm from the ground up using the very skills my in-laws constantly mocked. They laughed at my working-class background and my lack of a historic family name. They equated a quiet demeanor with stupidity and assumed my lack of designer labels meant a lack of resources. That arrogant assumption was about to become their ultimate downfall. I dragged the folder containing the fully mirrored hard drive onto the interface of my auditing software. The software I named Nemesis was a proprietary artificial intelligence model I coded entirely myself. It was designed to consume vast amounts of unstructured financial data, map out hidden relationships between shell corporations, and trace offshore wire transfers with surgical precision. Nemesis did not care about social standing or country club memberships. It only cared about numbers, and numbers never lie. As I hit the execute command, the monitors exploded with activity. Thousands of files began scrolling across the screens at lightning speed. Bank statements, tax returns, encrypted emails, and digital signature logs were rapidly unpacked and categorized. The Sterling family thought they had been incredibly clever. Derek and Richard Sr. had created a labyrinth of dummy corporations using fake addresses and fabricated board members to funnel their illicit funds. They had intentionally designed the corporate structure of Sterling Ventures LLC to be so convoluted that a standard human auditor would take years to untangle the mess. But Nemesis was not human. It could cross-reference millions of financial records against global banking databases in a matter of seconds. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and watched the algorithm dissect his entire secret life. The betrayal I had witnessed at the Ritz-Carlton earlier that evening felt distant, now replaced by the cold, analytical focus that had made me millions. Julian had looked me in the eye every single morning for 3 years while actively plotting my destruction. He had smiled at me across the breakfast table, knowing full well he was setting me up to take the fall for a $12 million tax fraud scheme. He thought he was the apex predator in our marriage. He was gravely mistaken. The initial progress bar on my screen reached 100%, and the secondary mapping phase began. A complex web of digital nodes appeared on the central monitor connecting the various Sterling enterprises. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished glass desk. The data visualization was breathtakingly thorough. Red warning indicators flashed across the screen, highlighting dozens of severe financial anomalies. I opened the specific folder Derek had mentioned in the VIP suite, the files pertaining to Sterling Ventures, LLC. There it was. My electronic signature perfectly replicated and stamped onto hundreds of highly illegal transfer authorizations. Julian had used the joint mortgage documents I signed 2 years ago to capture my exact digital signature profile. He and Derek had then utilized a sophisticated drafting program to automate the forging process. They had officially named me the primary guarantor and sole executive officer of a company that existed solely to launder money to the Cayman Islands. The sheer audacity of their plan was almost impressive. They had systematically drained the pension funds of their own commercial real estate employees, funneling the stolen cash through Sterling Ventures LLC to avoid taxation. Once the money was washed clean through a series of fake vendor payments, it was wired to an offshore account controlled exclusively by Richard Sr. and Julian. If the Internal Revenue Service audited the main Sterling Corporation, they would find nothing but clean books. All the toxic debt and criminal liability had been successfully isolated within Sterling Ventures, LLC. And legally speaking, I was the sole owner of that toxic wasteland. But arrogant men always make mistakes. In their rush to secure their stolen millions, they had committed a fatal error. They had severely underestimated the traceability of modern digital finance. Every single transfer left a microscopic digital footprint. My artificial intelligence software was currently highlighting every single one of those footprints, linking the offshore Cayman accounts directly back to the IP addresses located inside the Sterling family mansion. The evidence was irrefutable and completely damning. I continued digging deeper into their personal financial portfolios. What I found next genuinely shocked me. The grand Sterling Empire, the supposedly unbreakable foundation of their elite social status, was entirely an illusion. Nemesis revealed that their primary commercial real estate company was drowning in catastrophic debt. They had leveraged every single property they owned to secure massive high-interest loans from private equity firms. The sprawling estate where Vivian hosted her lavish charity galas was mortgaged to the absolute hilt. The luxury vehicles they paraded around Atlanta were all leased. Even the extravagant private jet they planned to take to Monaco was 4 months behind on its financing payments. They were living completely on borrowed money and stolen pension funds. They were not billionaires. They were sophisticated con artists balancing on a knife edge of total financial ruin. I pulled up the financial records for Lauren, the woman Julian intended to marry in Monaco. Her family possessed significant political power, but her personal bank accounts revealed a very different reality. She was practically bankrupt, surviving on maxed-out credit cards and loans from wealthy local political donors. Julian was not marrying her for love. He was marrying her for political protection, assuming her family name would shield him when the inevitable federal investigations began. Lauren was marrying Julian because she believed he possessed a billion-dollar real estate fortune that could rescue her from her mountain of debt. They were two desperate parasites, attempting to feed off each other, completely unaware that the host body was already dead. The diamond ring Lauren had proudly displayed in the dressing room caught my attention next. I ran a cross-reference check on the recent purchases made by Richard Sr. and Julian. The receipt for the 5-carat stone popped up on my screen instantly. Julian had not purchased the ring using his own personal funds. He had charged it directly to the corporate credit card issued under Sterling Ventures LLC. He had literally used the fraudulent company bearing my forged signature to buy an engagement ring for his mistress. A cold, cynical smile spread across my face as the absolute absurdity of their hubris washed over me. They believed my lack of a prestigious family background made me weak. They thought that because I did not attend historic galas or wear custom designer gowns, I was incapable of understanding high-level finance. They had mistaken my polite silence for profound stupidity. Vivian had constantly berated my simple wardrobe and quiet demeanor, calling me an embarrassment to their public image. Richard Sr. had treated me like a disposable asset, a convenient pawn to be sacrificed whenever the board required a scapegoat. Derek had viewed me as nothing more than a blank canvas for his criminal forgery, and Julian, my husband, had viewed me as a human shield. They were all about to learn a very painful lesson regarding the danger of underestimating a self-made woman. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard as I initiated the next sequence of my operation. Uncovering the extent of their criminal activity was only the first step. Having the evidence was powerful, but executing the perfect tactical strike required absolute precision. I opened a highly secure encrypted communication channel specifically reserved for my most elite financial partners. I was not going to rely solely on federal agents to deliver justice. The justice system moves entirely too slowly for my taste. I wanted them to feel the crushing weight of immediate and total devastation. I wanted to systematically strip away every single material possession that provided them with their false sense of superiority. I began drafting a master acquisition proposal, targeting every compromised loan held by the Sterling family. The algorithms confirmed my strategy was flawless. By sunrise, I would possess the power to obliterate them. I prepared to strike. I initiated a secure connection with my primary contact at Obsidian Capital, a ruthless hedge fund based in New York. The partners at Obsidian knew me only by my digital alias, but they trusted my data implicitly. Over the past 5 years, my audits had made them hundreds of millions of dollars by identifying vulnerable corporate targets ripe for hostile takeovers. I sent a highly encrypted message outlining a sudden and extremely lucrative acquisition opportunity in the Atlanta commercial real estate sector. I did not mention the Sterling name just yet. I simply provided the preliminary financial metrics of the toxic debt portfolios my artificial intelligence had uncovered. Within 3 minutes, the encrypted chat interface blinked with a response. They were ready to mobilize whatever capital I required. With my financial backing secured, I turned my full attention back to the glowing monitors. Nemesis was still churning through the massive data dump from Julian hard drive. I commanded the software to isolate every single physical asset registered to the Sterling family and trace the underlying financing. The results materialized on the screen in a cascading series of red flags. The reality of their financial situation was far worse than I had initially calculated. The billion-dollar Sterling empire was nothing more than a spectacular mirage built on a foundation of decaying leverage. They did not own a single brick of their empire outright. Every asset they possessed was hopelessly entangled in a disastrous web of cross-collateralization. It was a classic shell game played on a massive scale, and it was all on the verge of spectacular collapse. I started with the crown jewel of their public persona, the sprawling Buckhead estate where Richard and Vivian hosted their legendary anniversary gala. The property was valued at $8 million, but the AI revealed a labyrinth of secondary and tertiary mortgages stacked against the deed. Richard Sr. had borrowed against the equity of the estate 4 separate times, using the cash to artificially inflate the quarterly earnings of their primary commercial properties. He was literally draining the equity of his own home to make his failing business look profitable to outside investors. The luxury fleet of vehicles parked in their circular driveway told the exact same story of financial ruin. The two Rolls-Royce Phantoms. Vivian beloved Bentley and Julian customized Porsche were not symbols of generational wealth. They were leased through a shady subsidiary corporation that charged exorbitant interest rates. To make matters even more pathetic, the monthly lease payments were being funded by taking out short-term high-yield loans from predatory lenders. They were borrowing money at 20% interest just to maintain the appearance of driving expensive cars. It was financial suicide disguised as elite privilege. Vivian spent her days looking down on everyone else, completely oblivious to the fact that the very roof over her head and the car she drove were weeks away from repossession. Her entire identity was tied to a societal status that did not actually exist. The country club memberships, the designer wardrobes, the imported champagne, they were all financed by toxic debt that was compounding daily. The Sterling family was trapped in a financial death spiral of their own making. The deeper I dug into the corporate records, the more sinister the illusion became. Derek, my arrogant brother-in-law, was not simply a beneficiary of this massive fraud. He was an active and eager participant in a massive money laundering operation. The algorithm cracked the encryption on a hidden server folder labeled with Derek initials. Inside, I found the true purpose of his supposedly brilliant real estate acquisitions. Derek was not buying commercial properties to develop them. He was using them as temporary holding cells for dirty cash. He and Richard Sr. had established a network of fake construction companies and phantom supply vendors. They would funnel millions of dollars in fake invoices through these dummy corporations, claiming the money was being used for property renovations. In reality, there were no renovations taking place. The building sat empty and decaying while the cash was systematically washed through the fake vendors and routed directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They were effectively stealing money from their own legitimate investors and hiding it overseas to avoid taxation and creditors. And because they had forged my electronic signature onto the formation documents of Sterling Ventures, LLC, I was technically the legal owner of the dummy corporations, processing the fake invoices. They were laundering money right under the nose of the federal government and using my pristine background as a human shield. If the authorities looked closely at the money trail, they would see my name stamped on every single fraudulent transaction. Derek and Richard Sr. had built an engine of pure financial crime, and they had strapped me into the driver's seat without my knowledge. The absolute irony of their master plan became clearer with every file I opened. They thought they were untouchable because they had built a buffer between their crimes and their public identities. They believed their wealth and social standing made them immune to consequence. But their greed had blinded them to the digital trail they were leaving behind. I turned my attention to the engagement ring Lauren had flashed in the VIP suite. The 5-carat diamond that Julian had promised would secure her place in the Sterling dynasty. Nemesis traced the transaction back to a jewelry broker in Dubai. The payment had been executed using a wire transfer from one of the phantom construction companies. Julian had stolen money from his own family fraudulent money laundering operation to buy a ring for his mistress. He was using stolen funds to finance his infidelity. The sheer layers of betrayal were almost comical. Lauren believed she was marrying into a dynasty of billionaires. She thought the ring on her finger was a symbol of unending luxury and power. In reality, that diamond was a glowing beacon of federal wire fraud. It was a piece of criminal evidence sitting right on her hand. When the authorities eventually traced the funds, that ring would be seized as a stolen asset. Lauren would be publicly humiliated, stripped of her stolen jewelry, and forever associated with a massive federal indictment. The perfect elite marriage they were planning to announce in Monaco was nothing more than a merger of two sinking ships. They were rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic while patting themselves on the back for their brilliance. I spent the next several hours compiling the raw data into an impenetrable fortress of evidence. I categorized the forged documents, the offshore wire transfers, the fake vendor invoices, and the cross-collateralized loan agreements into a highly secure encrypted dossier. The Sterling family had handed me the exact tools required to dismantle their entire existence. I was not going to wait for the federal agents to conduct their scheduled raid on Tuesday. I was going to preemptively destroy the Sterling Empire before they even stepped foot on the tarmac for their flight to Monaco. I opened a direct communication line to the senior partners at Obsidian Capital. I outlined the exact structure of the Sterling toxic debt and proposed a ruthless acquisition strategy. Using my own massive hidden cash reserves, combined with the unlimited capital of the hedge fund, we were going to quietly purchase every single defaulted loan and overdue mortgage held by the Sterling family. We were going to buy their debt for pennies on the dollar, directly from the panicked private equity firms they had defrauded. Within 48 hours, I would legally become the sole primary creditor for the entire Sterling Corporation. I would own the paper on their mansions, their commercial buildings, their leased luxury cars, and their corporate jets. I would hold the absolute power to call in their debts immediately and trigger a total liquidation of their assets. The partners at Obsidian Capital agreed to the strategy, instantly recognizing the massive potential for profit. The trap was set, and the countdown to their total annihilation had officially begun. I leaned back in my chair and watched the final data packets transfer to my secure offshore backup servers. The sheer volume of their financial negligence was staggering. They had spent decades looking down their noses at working-class people, claiming their wealth was a product of superior intellect and divine right. Vivian had openly mocked my modest upbringing while wearing diamonds purchased with stolen retirement funds. Richard Sr. had publicly humiliated me at his anniversary gala while secretly drowning in an ocean of fraudulent loans. They were nothing but sophisticated parasites feeding off the hard work of others to maintain a grand illusion of superiority. I took a deep breath of the cool morning air. The sun was beginning to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting a golden light across the city. The arrogant Sterling family was waking up, unaware their reign of terror was over. I turned away from the window and walked back to my primary console. The time for observation had ended. It was time for execution. I opened a direct encrypted video link to Marcus Vance, the senior managing partner at Obsidian Capital in New York. Marcus was a ruthless corporate raider known for dismantling failing companies with absolute precision. He did not know my real name or my face. To him, I was simply Apex, the anonymous data architect who consistently fed him $100 million acquisition targets. My voice was masked by a distortion filter as his face appeared on my screen. He looked tired but intensely focused. I told him I had a priority acquisition target in Atlanta and that we needed to move with unprecedented speed. I transmitted the sanitized financial dossiers outlining the Sterling family toxic debt structure. Marcus' eyes widened as he scanned the documents. He immediately recognized the sheer scale of the fraud and the vulnerability of the assets. He asked me what the strategy was. I told him we were not going to short their stock or report them to regulatory agencies. I told him we were going to buy every single piece of debt they owed. Marcus let out a low whistle of appreciation. He knew that buying the bad debt of a massive real estate empire was highly risky unless you held the inside track on their liquidity. I assured him the data was flawless. The private equity firms and predatory lenders currently holding the Sterling paper were terrified of an impending default. If we swooped in and offered them an immediate cash buyout for the debt, they would sell it to us at a steep discount just to clear their books. Marcus agreed to deploy his shadow acquisition teams immediately, but he needed proof of capital to initiate the sweeping buyouts. This was the moment I stopped relying solely on hedge fund money and brought my own hidden wealth to the table. Over the past decade, I had amassed a massive personal fortune through my highly classified forensic auditing contracts. I had funneled my earnings into a series of secure offshore accounts that were completely invisible to Julian and his arrogant parents. I typed a rapid sequence of commands into my terminal, authorizing a direct wire transfer of $80 million into the Obsidian Capital holding account. Marcus stared at his monitor in shock as the funds cleared instantly. I instructed him to use my capital to aggressively acquire the sterling liabilities. I wanted total control, and I wanted it within 48 hours. The silent acquisition spree began immediately. Marcus deployed teams of aggressive financial negotiators to contact the various institutions holding the Sterling family debt. They started with the residential mortgages. Richard Sr. and Vivian had borrowed heavily against their sprawling Buckhead estate, using a secondary shadow lender who charged exorbitant interest rates. That lender was currently panicking because the Sterlings had missed their last two payments. When Marcus' team offered to buy the mortgage note outright, the lender agreed within an hour. The paperwork was digitally signed and sealed. By noon on Wednesday, I legally owned the paper on the luxurious mansion where my mother-in-law was currently packing her designer luggage. I effectively owned the roof over her head and possessed the legal right to foreclose the moment she defaulted. But I was not stopping at their primary residence. I directed the Obsidian teams to target the commercial assets. Derek, my smug brother-in-law, had used a network of shell companies to purchase several high-rise office buildings in downtown Atlanta. He believed these properties made him a real estate mogul. My data proved that these buildings were drastically underperforming and suffocating under the weight of toxic commercial loans. The regional banks holding these commercial notes were desperate to offload the risk. Marcus negotiators swooped in and purchased the debt for 80 cents on the dollar. The banks gladly took the cash loss just to remove the sterling name from their liability ledgers. In less than a day, I had absorbed the entire commercial foundation of their fake empire. Derek thought he was a genius broker orchestrating complex money laundering schemes. He had no idea that a woman he constantly belittled was quietly buying the ground out from under his expensive Italian leather shoes. Next, I targeted their vehicles. The Sterling family loved to parade their wealth using a fleet of luxury cars. They treated these vehicles as royal carriages. My algorithm had already identified the obscure financing company that held the leases for Vivian Bentley Julian Porsche and the two Rolls-Royce Phantoms they used for public events. This particular financing company was notorious for inserting aggressive immediate call provisions into their contracts. These provisions stated that if the borrower engaged in any fraudulent financial activity, the creditor possessed the absolute right to terminate the lease and repossess the assets immediately without waiting for a court order. I loved those provisions. I instructed Marcus to buy the vehicle leases at full price. The financing company was thrilled to cash out. By Thursday morning, I legally owned the vehicles they were currently using to drive to the country club. If I wanted to, I could have a tow truck pull Julian Porsche out of the Ritz-Carlton parking lot while he was eating lunch. But I needed to be patient. I needed the trap to snap shut all at once. The crown jewel of my silent acquisition was the private jet. The Sterling family had proudly announced their grand trip to Monaco, boasting about their exclusive Gulfstream aircraft. They used this jet as the ultimate symbol of their untouchable status. They flew it to private islands and exclusive ski resorts, ensuring everyone knew they traveled above the clouds. However, the aircraft was not theirs. It was financed through a highly specialized aviation leasing firm based in Chicago. My data sweep revealed that Richard Sr. had routinely falsified the maintenance logs and flight manifests to hide the fact that he was severely delinquent on the monthly financing payments. The Chicago firm had been threatening to ground the plane for weeks. I personally drafted the acquisition order for the Gulfstream contract. I authorized an additional transfer of $12 million to purchase the aircraft debt outright. The aviation leasing firm was completely relieved to sever ties with the Sterling family. They processed the transaction with record speed. By Thursday afternoon, the title and financing rights to the Gulfstream jet were legally transferred to a holding company that I controlled exclusively. I was now the sole primary creditor for the aircraft they intended to board the following morning. The pilot, the flight crew, and the tarmac security were all legally obligated to answer to my holding company. Julian and his mistress Lauren were actively planning a luxurious engagement announcement in Monaco. They had purchased a 5-carat diamond using stolen funds and believed they were escaping the country right before the federal agents raided their offices. They thought they were flying to a paradise of immense wealth and political protection. They did not know that the very plane they planned to escape on belonged entirely to the woman they were leaving behind to take the fall. I sat in my command center and watched the final confirmation emails flood into my secure inbox. The 48-hour window was closing, and the acquisition phase was a total success. I had effectively purchased the entire Sterling family debt portfolio. I owned their homes, I owned their commercial real estate, I owned their cars, and I owned their private jet. I had legally cornered them into a financial box with absolutely no exit doors. My silent hedge fund partners at Obsidian Capital had executed the strategy flawlessly, leaving absolutely zero digital traces that could connect the buyouts back to my name. As far as the public record showed, the Sterling debt had simply been consolidated by an aggressive, anonymous corporate entity. The contrast between my reality and their reality was staggering. While I sat in a high-security server room, legally dismantling their entire bloodline, they were completely consumed by their own arrogance. I accessed the public social media feeds of my sister-in-law, Camille, and Julian mistress Lauren. They were actively posting updates about their impending European vacation. Vivian had uploaded a video showcasing her newly purchased resort wear, complaining about the difficulty of finding good domestic help to watch the estate while they were away. Derek had posted a photograph of himself drinking premium bourbon, with a caption boasting about generational wealth and untouchable success. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, totally blind to the massive drop waiting just inches from their feet. They genuinely believed their coordinated cruelty at the anniversary gala had broken my spirit. They assumed I was sitting in our shared home crying over the end of my marriage and nervously preparing to babysit their children. I closed the social media feeds feeling a deep sense of calm settle over my mind. The emotional manipulation they had subjected me to for 3 years no longer held any power. They had tried to use me as a disposable shield for their criminal enterprise, and in doing so they had inadvertently handed me the keys to their kingdom. I opened a fresh, secure document on my desktop and began compiling the final physical evidence. I needed hard copies of the new debt ownership deeds, the forged tax documents, and the offshore money laundering transfer logs. I sent the files to a secure, heavy-duty laser printer in the corner of my office. The machine hummed to life, churning out page after page of undeniable proof. I walked over to a sleek black leather briefcase resting on a side table. It was a sharp professional piece of luggage designed for high-stakes corporate warfare. I gathered the freshly printed documents, organizing them into perfectly labeled folders. The first folder contained the proof of their $12 million federal fraud. The second folder contained the legal documents proving my absolute ownership of their entire debt portfolio. The third folder contained the immediate repossession orders for the Gulfstream jet. I placed the folders into the briefcase and snapped the golden locks shut. The sound echoed with a satisfying finality in the quiet room. It was Thursday night. In less than 12 hours, the Sterling family would arrive at the private aviation terminal, expecting to embark on the most luxurious trip of their lives. They would arrive with their designer luggage, their smuggled cash, and their breathtaking arrogance. They would arrive expecting a smooth takeoff into their new fraudulent future. I walked over to my closet and pulled out a sharply tailored charcoal gray power suit. I laid it out carefully, making sure every seam was perfect. I was not going to the airport to cry. I was not going to beg my husband to stay or plead for my in-laws to accept me. I was going to the airport to collect my debts. I was going to look them in the eyes and watch their fake billion-dollar empire shatter into dust. The silent acquisition was complete. It was time for the reckoning. I needed to ensure that my legal and financial maneuverings were backed by the absolute force of the federal government. Buying their debt gave me civil control over their assets, but exposing their crimes would guarantee they lost their freedom. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors of my command center. It was time to prepare the final arsenal. I initiated a highly specialized extraction protocol within my artificial intelligence software. The system began isolating every specific instance of wire fraud, money laundering, and forgery buried within the mirrored hard drive. I needed the evidence to be so airtight that no defense attorney in the entire country could possibly poke a single hole in it. I started the meticulous process with the forged signatures. I pulled the original digital timestamps from the joint mortgage documents Julian and I had signed 2 years ago. I then placed those legitimate digital signatures side by side with the metadata from the Sterling Ventures LLC incorporation papers. The algorithmic comparison proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the signature on the fraudulent documents had been mathematically duplicated and pasted. I generated a certified forensic report detailing the exact time and internet protocol address used to execute the forgery. The address traced directly back to Derek's personal laptop, located securely inside the main study of the Sterling estate. Next, I tackled the offshore transfers. I compiled a comprehensive ledger of the $12 million they had illegally siphoned from their commercial real estate employee pension funds. I created a dynamic visual flowchart that tracked the money as it moved from the legitimate Sterling corporate accounts into the dummy construction companies. From there, the chart traced the stolen funds through a series of complex international wire transfers, ultimately landing in the hidden Cayman Island accounts, controlled exclusively by Richard Sr. and Julian. I painstakingly included every fake invoice, every phantom vendor contract, and every encrypted email between my husband and his father discussing the illicit movements. I even found a series of text messages between Derek and Julian, laughing about how easy it was to steal from their own employees. I packaged this entire mountain of undeniable evidence into a single highly encrypted digital dossier. I double-checked the encryption protocols, ensuring the data transfer would remain completely invisible to any potential interceptors before finalizing the compilation. I named the master file Operation Monaco. The next crucial decision was determining exactly who would receive this dossier. The Sterling family possessed incredibly deep ties to local law enforcement and city officials. Lauren Father, the powerful local politician who was eagerly anticipating her marriage to Julian, routinely buried scandals for his wealthy constituents. If I handed this evidence over to the local authorities or the district attorney, there was a phenomenally high probability the file would conveniently disappear. Richard Sr. would simply make a few well-placed phone calls, pay a few substantial bribes, and the entire investigation would be swept completely under the rug. I could not risk local corruption ruining my carefully orchestrated takedown. I needed to bypass the local authorities entirely. Fortunately, my secret career as the anonymous founder of Apex Financial Forensics had provided me with direct and unfettered access to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. I had spent years supplying irrefutable data to federal agents, assisting them in taking down international crime syndicates and corrupt corporate executives. I had a direct encrypted communication line to a senior supervisory special agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation named Marcus Thorne. I also maintained a highly secure contact within the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, a veteran agent who specialized specifically in offshore tax evasion and elite wealth concealment. I opened my secure communication terminal and initiated a joint video conference with both agents. My digital alias shielded my true identity, filtering my voice and obscuring my face behind a generic avatar. When Thorne and Jenkins appeared on the split screen, they looked alert and immediately ready for action. They knew from past experience that when my alias initiated contact, it meant a massive high-value target had just been acquired. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or vague introductions. I told them I had a fully comprehensive turnkey package regarding a $12 million corporate wire fraud and money laundering operation happening right in their immediate jurisdiction. I explained the exact mechanics of the scheme, the systematic use of stolen pension funds, the fabricated construction vendors, and the illegal offshore accounts masking the wealth. I transmitted the encrypted dossier to their secure federal servers and provided them with the complex decryption keys. I watched their eyes widen on the screen as they opened the files and realized the target was the infamous Sterling family. The Sterlings were considered untouchable royalty in Atlanta high society. Taking them down would be a massive career-making victory for both agents. I walked them through the forensic reports, methodically pointing out the undeniable proof of the forged signatures and the direct digital link to the Cayman accounts. I explained precisely how they had attempted to frame an innocent party by embedding a stolen electronic signature into the fake holding company documents. Thorne and Jenkins were visibly stunned by the sheer arrogance and profound stupidity of the Sterling family master plan. They instantly confirmed that the forensic evidence I provided was more than enough to secure immediate federal arrest warrants for Richard Sr., Derek, and Julian. Now came the most critical part of my strategy. I told Thorne and Jenkins that I possessed highly credible and urgent intelligence regarding the target's immediate flight risk. I informed them that the primary suspects were actively planning to board a private Gulfstream jet bound for Monaco at exactly 10 o'clock on Friday morning. I emphasized heavily that if the plane was allowed to leave the tarmac, the federal government would lose their primary targets to a non-extradition jurisdiction, and the stolen $12 million would be gone forever. I set a strict and absolutely unyielding tactical timeline. I demanded that the coordinated federal raid be executed at the private aviation terminal precisely at 9:45 in the morning. I wanted the FBI and the IRS to descend on the tarmac right as the Sterling family was preparing to board their stolen jet. I wanted them intercepted at the absolute height of their unearned arrogance. Agent Thorne agreed without a single moment of hesitation. He assured me that his tactical teams would be fully mobilized, heavily armed, and ready to strike exactly on my mandated schedule. Agent Jenkins enthusiastically confirmed that the IRS would simultaneously freeze all remaining Sterling bank accounts the exact moment the handcuffs clicked onto their wrists. I thanked them for their swift cooperation, ended the secure transmission, and gently closed my laptop. The federal trap was perfectly set, and the heavy steel jaws were heavily primed to permanently snap shut. My personal revenge was now officially backed by the full power and overwhelming authority of the United States government. The Sterling family thought they were leaving me behind to suffer in utter silence. They had no idea I had just arranged a very special and highly publicized federal escort for their grand European departure. I stood up from my heavy oak desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse condominium. The city of Atlanta stretched out beneath me, a sprawling grid of lights and shadows. Tomorrow morning, the entire social hierarchy of this city would be permanently altered. I had spent the last 3 years playing the role of the quiet, unassuming, and obedient wife. I had absorbed their insults, their condescension, and their relentless cruelty. But tomorrow they would learn that true power does not come from inherited wealth or societal connections. True power comes from leverage, intelligence, and the ruthless application of undeniable facts. I walked back to my preparation table and reviewed my own personal arsenal. The leather briefcase containing the debt ownership deeds, the repossession orders for the private jet, and the proof of their financial collapse was fully secured. I ran my hands over the smooth black leather, feeling the immense weight of the documentation inside. This briefcase held the complete unraveling of everything they held dear. I had the federal warrants locked in and the tactical raid timed to the exact minute. Everything was perfectly aligned for maximum destruction. I raised a final, solemn, silent toast to Vivian, Camille, Derek, Richard Sr., and Julian. They wanted a dramatic family spectacle to entertain their elite friends, and I was about to deliver a flawless performance they would never forget. I envisioned the sheer panic that would wash over their faces when the sirens began to wail across the private runway. The arsenal was fully prepared. The night was finally over. The sun was rising on the day the Sterling Empire would fall. The morning sun beat down on the pristine concrete of the private aviation terminal at Peachtree DeKalb Airport, casting long shadows across the tarmac. A convoy of black luxury SUVs pulled through the secure gates, completely bypassing the standard security checkpoints reserved for commercial travelers. The vehicles glided to a smooth halt next to the gleaming white fuselage of the Gulfstream G650 jet. The aircraft sat bathed in the morning light, an ultimate symbol of elite status and unrestricted freedom. The flight crew stood in a perfect line at the base of the boarding stairs wearing crisp uniforms and welcoming smiles. They were ready to cater to the every whim of the infamous Sterling family. None of the crew members knew that the massive jet behind them no longer belonged to the aviation leasing firm that signed their paychecks. They had no idea they were currently standing on a runway preparing to board a plane that was legally owned by the woman the Sterlings were actively plotting to destroy. The heavy doors of the SUVs swung open, and the Sterling family spilled out onto the tarmac in a chaotic flurry of designer labels and oversized sunglasses. A team of baggage handlers immediately rushed forward to manage the sheer volume of custom Louis Vuitton luggage being unloaded from the trunks. There were dozens of trunks, garment bags, and oversized vanity cases all packed with haute couture for a month-long European vacation. Vivian emerged from the lead vehicle wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and a flowing silk caftan that billowed in the warm Georgia breeze. She looked every inch the untouchable matriarch of a billionaire dynasty. Close behind her, Lauren stepped onto the concrete holding her smartphone high in the air at the perfect angle. Lauren and Vivian immediately huddled together, framing the gleaming private jet in the background of their shot. Lauren tapped the screen of her phone to initiate a live broadcast to her hundreds of thousands of social media followers. A red light blinked on the screen, indicating that the world was watching. Vivian adjusted her posture, tilting her chin up to catch the optimal lighting. Lauren flashed a bright, manufactured smile directly into the camera lens. "Good morning to all my beautiful followers," Lauren chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We are coming to you live from the private runway. It is officially the start of the Sterling family European takeover. We are about to board our jet and fly directly to Monaco. Say hello to my future mother-in-law, the fabulous Vivian Sterling." Vivian waved gracefully at the camera, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking together. She leaned into the frame, ensuring her designer caftan was fully visible. "We are so excited to get away from the dreary Atlanta humidity," Vivian drawled. "Monaco in the spring is an absolute necessity for our family. It is the only place where you can truly find peace and quiet among people of the correct social standing. We plan to spend the next month sipping vintage champagne on the yacht and completely unplugging from the stress of managing our empire." Lauren giggled and held up her left hand, waving her fingers right in front of the camera lens. The massive 5-carat diamond engagement ring caught the morning sun, sending brilliant flashes of refracted light directly into the lens. The ring that Julian had purchased using stolen funds, funneled through a fake construction company, was now the star of a global live stream. And just a little reminder of why this trip is so special, Lauren boasted, practically shoving the stolen diamond into the camera. "Julian and I have a massive announcement coming up this week. We are going to be hosting an exclusive engagement gala at the Casino de Monte Carlo. Stay tuned for updates because it is going to be the social event of the entire decade. Only the absolute best for the Sterling standard." While Vivian and Lauren paraded their stolen wealth for their digital audience, Derek and his wife Camille were lounging against the chrome railing of the boarding stairs. Derek had already bullied one of the flight attendants into opening a bottle of Louis Roederer Cristal before they even stepped foot on the plane. He held a delicate crystal flute in one hand while using the other to scroll through his phone. He wore a custom-tailored linen suit and a pair of imported Italian loafers, entirely unaware that his brother-in-law secretly despised him and that his massive commercial real estate portfolio had been liquidated overnight. Camille stood next to him wearing a tennis skirt and a visor, looking as though she was preparing for a match rather than an international flight. She took a long sip of her champagne and looked over at Julian, who was speaking quietly with his father near the nose of the plane. Camille let out a sharp, malicious laugh and nudged Derek in the ribs. "Can you even imagine what Zoya is doing right now?" Camille asked, her voice carrying over the hum of the aircraft auxiliary power unit. "She is probably sitting in that penthouse organizing Julian dry cleaning and meal prepping his lunches for the week. She has absolutely no idea he is standing right here getting ready to fly to Europe with his new future wife." Derek smirked and took another sip of his champagne. "Zoya is completely oblivious," he sneered. "She is the most boring, pathetic excuse for a woman I have ever met. She actually thought marrying into this family meant she was one of us. She thought she was going to be a Sterling. It is genuinely embarrassing how naive she is. She lacks any basic understanding of how the real world operates. Camille threw her head back and laughed loudly. I cannot wait to see the news reports next week, she cackled. Picture this. We will be sitting on the deck of our yacht in Monaco, sipping dirty martinis, watching the Mediterranean sunset. And right at that exact moment, the feds are going to kick down the door of the penthouse and drag Zoya out in handcuffs. She is going to be sitting in a federal holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit, completely confused about why she is being charged with $12 million in corporate fraud. Derek shook his head in absolute amusement. The best part is she literally signed the documents. Julian got her exact digital signature from their mortgage papers, and I pasted it directly onto every single fake vendor invoice and shell company incorporation form. The digital trail leads directly to her laptop. When the FBI audits those servers, they are going to find her name stamped all over the Cayman Island transfers. She is going to spend the next 20 years in a maximum security federal prison, and we are going to be legally untouchable. It is the perfect crime. We wash the money clean, we dump the liability on the quiet little mouse, and we walk away, billionaires. They clinked their crystal flutes together in a mocking toast to my impending incarceration. They were entirely convinced of their own untouchable genius. They believed they were apex predators who had successfully manipulated the legal and financial systems to their ultimate advantage. They had no conception that the champagne they were drinking, the glass they were holding, and the stairs they were leaning against all belonged to the quiet little mouse they were currently laughing at. A few yards away, Richard Sr. and Julian were engaged in a deep conversation, completely ignoring the live streaming performance of their respective partners. Richard Sr. stood with his hands clasped behind his back, projecting the aura of a seasoned corporate titan. He was completely blind to the fact that his sprawling Buckhead estate was now legally owned by an anonymous holding company, and that his entire empire was completely insolvent. You executed everything flawlessly, Julian, Richard Sr. said, his voice brimming with paternal pride. The final transfer to the Cayman accounts cleared last night. The pension funds are completely untraceable now. The commercial accounts are empty, and the liability is completely isolated within Sterling Ventures, LLC. You handled the Zoya situation with absolute perfection. She never suspected a thing. Julian smiled, a cold, arrogant expression that I had once mistaken for confidence. It was almost too easy, Dad, Julian replied, adjusting the cuffs of his designer shirt. She trusts me completely. She is so desperate for validation that she never questions anything I do. She actually thinks I am at a 2-day real estate seminar in Chicago right now. She packed my bags for me last night. I needed a clean break, and Lauren provides the political cover we need with her father connections. By the time Zoya realizes what happened, the feds will already have her locked in an interrogation room. She does not have the resources or the intellect to fight a federal indictment. She will take a plea deal out of sheer panic. Richard Sr. chuckled and patted his son heavily on the shoulder. You are a true Sterling, Julian. You understand what it takes to survive and thrive at this level. We do not apologize for taking what is ours. We simply outmaneuver the weak. Let her take the fall. It is the only useful thing she has ever done for this family. Now let us get on this plane. I have a sudden craving for fresh Mediterranean seafood, and I am tired of standing on this hot concrete. Julian nodded and gestured toward the boarding stairs. The flight captain, a tall man in a crisp uniform, stepped out onto the top landing of the stairs and looked down at the gathered family. He checked his clipboard and offered a professional smile to the group below. Good morning, Mr. Sterling, the captain called out over the tarmac. The flight plan to Monaco has been fully logged and cleared by air traffic control. We are just waiting for final clearance from the tower. If your party would like to board now, we can get you settled in and begin our pre-flight service. We have your preferred vintage of champagne already chilled in the cabin. Vivian immediately ended her live stream with a dramatic blown kiss to the camera. Did you hear that, everyone, she announced, clapping her hands together? The captain says we are ready. Gather your things quickly. I simply cannot stand in this heat for another minute. My skin is beginning to feel terribly dry. Lauren, darling, make sure you get a photo of us walking up the stairs. It is the perfect shot for the final post before we take off. The family began to move toward the stairs, a collective mass of unearned privilege and staggering hubris. They were laughing and joking, congratulating each other on their brilliance and their immense wealth. They believed they were stepping into a golden elevator that would lift them far above the reach of the law and the consequences of their actions. They were at the absolute peak of their delusion, entirely convinced that they had successfully conquered the world and destroyed me in the process. Julian placed his hand on the small of Lauren's back, guiding her toward the boarding ramp. Derek grabbed another bottle of champagne from the flight attendant and tucked it under his arm. Richard Sr. took Vivian's hand, acting the part of the devoted billionaire patriarch. They placed their feet on the bottom step of the aircraft stairs, perfectly aligned for Lauren's final social media photograph. They smiled widely, flashing perfect white teeth at the camera lens, completely oblivious to the world outside their immediate bubble. They were totally unaware that the perimeter of the private aviation terminal had just been breached. The screech of heavy tires against the pristine tarmac shattered their idyllic morning moment. 6 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans tore through the security checkpoint, moving in a synchronized tactical formation. They roared across the runway, moving with terrifying speed and precision. The vehicles swerved violently, forming an impenetrable steel barricade directly around the nose and boarding stairs of the Gulfstream jet. The sudden, aggressive maneuver forced the flight crew to stumble backward in shock. Vivian shrieked and dropped her smartphone, watching the screen shatter against the concrete. Derek fumbled his crystal flute, sending expensive champagne spilling entirely over his imported Italian loafers. The perfectly manufactured illusion of the Sterling family departure evaporated in an instant, replaced by the harsh, chaotic reality of a federal raid. The heavy doors of the lead Suburbans flew open simultaneously. 24 heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the FBI and IRS insignias swarmed the aircraft. They moved with absolute authority, securing the perimeter and physically blocking the boarding ramp. The pilot and flight crew immediately raised their hands, backing away from the aircraft. Richard Sr. stepped forward, his face flushed with extreme indignation. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the untouchable billionaire persona he had spent decades cultivating. He began shouting at the agents, demanding badge numbers and threatening to call the chief of police. He bellowed that they were trespassing on private property and delaying an international flight. He was entirely ignored. The federal agents simply formed a silent wall, waiting for the final vehicle to arrive. A sleek, black, armored Cadillac Escalade pulled up smoothly behind the federal blockade. The tinted rear door opened, and I stepped out onto the sun-baked tarmac. I wore a tailored charcoal gray power suit, my posture perfectly straight, and my expression carved from solid ice. I was flanked immediately by 4 of the most elite corporate litigators from New York, each carrying heavy leather briefcases containing the total sum of the Sterling family destruction. I adjusted my cuffs and walked deliberately toward the boarding stairs, my heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete. The reaction from my in-laws was a masterpiece of human psychology. For a split second, there was total absolute silence. The wind seemed to stop blowing. Vivian's mouth hung open in a comical expression of sheer disbelief. Lauren squinted from behind her oversized sunglasses, trying to process how the quiet, submissive wife had bypassed federal security. Camille grabbed Derek, arm, her smug smirk completely wiped away. They stared at me, as if an apparition had just materialized on the runway. Julian was the first to break the silence. His initial shock rapidly warped into condescending anger. He stepped off the bottom stair and marched toward me, shaking his head in feigned pity. He assumed I was having a mental breakdown. He genuinely believed I had hired private security in a desperate, pathetic attempt to stop him from leaving with his mistress. "Zoya, what is the meaning of this?" Julian demanded, his voice dripping with arrogant authority. "You are making an absolute fool of yourself. I know you are upset about the divorce, but crashing my flight with this ridiculous stunt is pathetic even for you." Go back to the penthouse before I have you arrested for trespassing. You are embarrassing the family. I did not stop walking until I stood less than 3 feet away from him. I did not shrink under his gaze. I did not lower my eyes. I looked directly at the man who had plotted to send me to a maximum security prison, and I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile that made him involuntarily take a half-step backward. I am not here to stop your flight, Julian, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent tarmac. And I am certainly not here to beg for my marriage. I am here to collect my property. Richard Sr. shoved his way past his son, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Listen to me, you ungrateful little girl, he barked, pointing a trembling finger at my face. I do not know how you managed to follow us here, or who these men in fake vests are, but you are going to turn around and leave immediately. This aircraft is private property. We are departing from Monaco, and you are going back to the miserable life you came from. I gestured to the lead corporate litigator standing to my right. He stepped forward smoothly, opening his leather briefcase and extracting a thick stack of legal documents stamped with official court seals. Actually, Richard, that is where you are mistaken, I replied, my tone dangerously calm. You do not own this aircraft. You missed the last 4 financing payments to the Chicago aviation leasing firm. They terminated your contract and sold the debt. As of yesterday afternoon, the title to this Gulfstream G650 is legally registered to a holding company. I am the sole proprietor of that holding company. You are currently trespassing on my private jet. Richard Sr. froze. His hand dropped slowly to his side. The aggressive bluster instantly drained from his face, replaced by a sudden flickering realization of impending doom. He looked at the legal documents in the lawyer's hands, and then back at me, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible reality of the situation. Derek pushed his way to the front, attempting to salvage their rapidly disintegrating authority. This is a bluff, Derek sneered, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant punch. You do not have the money to buy an airplane lease, Zoya. You do not have the money to buy anything. You are just trying to cause a scene because Julian dumped you for someone better. I turned my cold gaze to Derek. You are absolutely right, Derek, about one thing. I did not just buy the airplane lease. I bought everything. I snapped my fingers, and my legal team began distributing the thick dossiers directly into the trembling hands of the Sterling family. I bought the secondary mortgages on the Buckhead estate because you missed 2 critical payments. I bought the toxic loans on your downtown commercial properties. I even bought the high-yield financing contracts for the leased luxury vehicles currently parked in your driveway. I am now the sole primary creditor for the entire Sterling Corporation and every personal asset you allegedly possess. Vivian let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as she stared down at the foreclosure notices bearing her name. Her knees buckled slightly, and Lauren had to grab her arm to keep her from collapsing onto the tarmac. Julian stared at the documents in absolute horror. The color vanished from his cheeks, leaving him looking physically ill. His eyes darted wildly between the legal paperwork, the grim-faced federal agents, and me. The invincible armor of his elite upbringing was shattering into a million pieces right before my eyes. He finally understood that I had not just uncovered his betrayal. I had systematically dismantled his entire existence. This is impossible, Julian stammered, his voice cracking. You are a clerk. You do not have millions of dollars. You do not know anything about corporate finance. How did you do this? You mistook my polite silence for profound stupidity, Julian, I answered, my voice echoing with absolute finality. You thought because I did not care about your country club memberships or your designer labels that I was weak. While you were busy taking out predatory loans to fund your fake billionaire lifestyle, I was building one of the most profitable forensic auditing algorithms in the global financial sector. You built an illusion. I built an empire. The immense satisfaction of watching his mind break under the weight of the truth was intoxicating. But the financial ruin was only the first phase of my retaliation. The true devastation was yet to come. I stepped aside and nodded to Special Agent Thorne, who moved forward with his team of FBI and IRS agents. They formed a tight circle around the Sterling family, cutting off any potential route of escape. Richard Sterling, Julian Sterling and Derek Sterling. Agent Thorne announced, his voice booming with absolute federal authority. You are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, international money laundering, and the embezzlement of $12 million in corporate pension funds. The words hit the group like a physical explosive. Camille screamed, dropping her designer purse onto the concrete. Lauren backed away from Julian, as if he had suddenly caught a highly infectious disease. She stared at him in utter revulsion, her dreams of a billionaire dynasty evaporating into the humid morning air. She looked down at the 5-carat diamond on her hand, suddenly realizing it was not a ticket to high society, but a glowing beacon of federal crime. Richard Sr. began to hyperventilate. He clutched at the collar of his expensive shirt, gasping for air as 2 federal agents grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the runway. The great untouchable titan of Atlanta real estate was reduced to a weeping, trembling old man in a matter of seconds. Derek tried to run. He spun around and sprinted toward the nose of the plane, but an IRS tactical agent tackled him to the concrete before he made it 5 yards. Derek's face slammed into the tarmac, scraping his pristine features against the rough ground. He was hauled to his feet, bleeding and sobbing, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado. Julian did not run. He stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his total destruction. He looked at me, his eyes wide, with a desperate, pathetic plea for mercy. The arrogant smirk was gone. The condescending tone was eradicated. He finally realized that the woman he had intended to frame for his crimes was the very architect of his absolute ruin. Zoya. Please. Julian begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic whimper as the agents approached him. You cannot do this. We are married. We can fix this. I will give you whatever you want. Please do not let them take me. I looked at the man who had shared my bed, who had smiled at me across the breakfast table while actively plotting to send me to a federal prison. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, no sorrow, just the cold clinical satisfaction of a perfectly executed audit. I am not Zoya right now, Julian. I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Right now, I am the primary creditor executing a hostile takeover of your fraudulent life. Your assets are seized, your bank accounts are frozen, your offshore Cayman Island transfers have been fully decrypted and handed over to the Department of Justice. You have absolutely nothing left. The agents grabbed Julian's wrists, twisting them sharply behind his back. He cried out in pain as the steel cuffs locked into place. He looked back at me one final time as they dragged him toward the waiting federal vehicles. He looked like a terrified little boy, realizing that the monsters in the dark were entirely real, and they had come specifically for him. Vivian was hysterical. She was screaming at the agents, demanding to speak to the mayor, demanding to call her friends in the Senate. She threatened to sue the entire federal government while simultaneously begging Lauren not to leave. Lauren, however, had already removed the 5-carat diamond ring from her finger. She tossed the stolen jewelry onto the tarmac next to Derek, spilled champagne, and walked away without looking back, desperately trying to distance herself from the radioactive blast radius of the Sterling family collapse. I stood on the runway and watched as the agents loaded Richard Sr., Derek, and Julian into the back of the armored Suburbans. The doors slammed shut, sealing them inside their new reality. The convoy of federal vehicles turned around and sped back toward the security gates, carrying the shattered remains of the Sterling dynasty, away to face federal processing and decades behind bars. The runway was suddenly very quiet. The flight crew stood in stunned silence, having witnessed the total annihilation of their former employers. My legal team remained standing at attention, awaiting my final instructions. I looked down at the forged documents, the scattered designer luggage, and the abandoned diamond ring glittering on the concrete. The illusion was permanently broken. The hostile takeover was a total victory. I turned to the captain of my new Gulfstream jet. He immediately straightened his posture, looking at me with profound respect and a healthy dose of fear. "Captain," I said, my voice ringing clear in the morning air, "please prepare the cabin for departure. We are no longer flying to Monaco. Reroute the flight plan to New York. I have a meeting with my partners at Obsidian Capital to discuss the liquidation of my newly acquired assets." The captain nodded smartly. Right away, Mom. I walked up the boarding stairs, leaving the remnants of the Sterling family on the tarmac. I stepped into the luxurious cabin of my jet, taking my seat as the engines began to roar to life. The sky was clear, the runway was open, and I was finally ready to fly. The sky was clear, the runway was open, and I was finally ready to fly. But as I settled into the plush ivory leather of the Gulfstream's master cabin, feeling the gentle vibration of the Rolls-Royce engines spooling up, I signaled the flight attendant to delay our taxi clearance. I needed a moment. I poured myself a single glass of sparkling water, looking out the reinforced oval window at the distant flashing red and blue lights of the federal convoy carrying the Sterling men away. The quiet hum of the cabin was a stark contrast to the beautiful, chaotic symphony of destruction that had played out on this very tarmac just half an hour prior. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to savor the memory, replaying the exact sequence of events, focusing on the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of Richard Sr. before I systematically dismantled his reality. When my armored Cadillac Escalade had first breached their pathetic little departure ceremony, the shock on their faces had been instantaneous. But shock, especially in men who have spent a lifetime insulated by billions of dollars, quickly curdles into indignant rage. Richard Sr. had been the first to recover from the initial paralysis. As I had stepped onto the concrete, flanked by my elite corporate litigators and the imposing presence of federal agents holding back, Richard had puffed out his chest, his face contorting into a mask of pure, venomous entitlement. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard had roared, his voice cracking like a whip across the tarmac, entirely ignoring the tactical vests of the agents surrounding the perimeter. He had marched directly toward me, his expensive Italian loafers slapping the ground aggressively. "Zoya, have you completely lost your mind? You bring this circus to my private terminal." He hadn't even waited for my response. In his mind, I was still just the obedient, invisible daughter-in-law, a minor nuisance overstepping her bounds. He had turned his back to me, an ultimate gesture of disrespect, and began snapping his fingers at the terminal manager and the Gulfstream's pilot, who were standing frozen near the boarding stairs. "Captain, get security out here immediately!" Richard had bellowed, waving his hand dismissively in my direction as if swatting away a persistent gnat. "I want this deranged woman and her hired actors thrown off this tarmac right now. This is a secure private aviation facility, not a stage for a hysterical ex-wife to throw a tantrum. Call the airport police. Have her arrested for trespassing. We have a flight corridor to Monaco to maintain, and I will not be delayed by this pathetic display." He had turned back to me, sneering, his upper lip curled in profound disgust. "Did you really think a few rented suits and black SUVs would intimidate me, Zoya? I am Richard Sterling. I own this city. I own the politicians, the judges, and the police force you think you can weaponize against me. You are nothing. You have always been nothing. Now get out of my sight before I decide to crush you completely." I hadn't flinched. I hadn't raised my voice. I had simply stood there perfectly composed in my charcoal power suit, the morning breeze lifting a stray lock of my hair. I let him finish his tirade, letting his arrogant words hang in the humid Georgia air. When silence finally fell over the tarmac, broken only by the whine of the jet's auxiliary power unit, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement, it was the cold, terrifying smile of an executioner who had just been handed the axe. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Richard," I had said, my voice eerily calm, carrying effortlessly across the space between us. "This is a secure private aviation facility, and trespassing is a serious offense." I raised my right hand, snapping my fingers once. The gesture was a mirror of his own arrogant command seconds prior, but mine carried the weight of actual undeniable power. My lead corporate attorney, a formidable man named Harrison, from one of Manhattan's most ruthless financial litigation firms, stepped forward. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried a thick, black leather portfolio. He unclasped the brass lock with a sharp, definitive click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. "What is this?" Richard had demanded, his eyes narrowing as Harrison extended a stack of heavy, watermarked legal documents toward him. "I'm not reading your garbage divorce demands, Zoya. Julian's lawyers will handle you. These aren't divorce papers, Richard, I had replied, taking a step closer, invading his personal space, forcing him to look me in the eye. That is a comprehensive ledger of the Sterling Empire's debt, specifically the debt that I now own. I watched his brow furrow, a flicker of genuine confusion piercing his armor of arrogance. What are you talking about? I am talking about the secondary mortgages on your Buckhead estate. I explained, my voice crisp and analytical. I am talking about the mezzanine financing on your downtown commercial high-rises. I am talking about the bridge loans you so desperately took out to cover the margin calls on your failing offshore investments. For the past 6 months, while you and Julian were busy stealing from your own employees' pension funds to keep your heads above water, your creditors were getting nervous. They were looking to offload your toxic debt to mitigate their exposure. I stepped even closer, lowering my voice, so only he and his immediate family could hear the absolute finality in my tone. I created an anonymous holding company, Apex Financial, and I began purchasing your debt portfolios for pennies on the dollar. You were so over-leveraged, Richard, so arrogant in your belief that the markets would always bounce back for a sterling. You ignored the default clauses, you missed the restructuring deadlines. As of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, Apex Financial executed the acceleration clauses on every single loan. Richard's face had drained of color, his skin turning a sickly ashen gray. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Behind him, Vivian had let out a soft, terrified gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Derek and Camille looked completely paralyzed. I am not just your daughter-in-law, Richard, I stated, delivering the first real bombshell. I am your primary secured creditor. I own the paper on your houses, your commercial properties, your cars, and your dummy corporations. You don't own the city anymore. You don't even own the shoes on your feet. Lies! Richard had suddenly exploded, spittle flying from his lips, his voice cracking with a desperate, frantic energy. It's a trick, a bluff. You don't have that kind of capital. My lawyers will bury you in litigation for the next 20 years. We will tie this up in appellate courts until you are bankrupt. You don't have lawyers anymore, Richard, I reminded him gently, because as of this morning their retainer accounts were frozen during the federal asset seizure. Which brings me to your immediate transportation problem. I had turned away from his sputtering, furious face and looked directly at the Gulfstream's pilot, who was watching the exchange with wide, anxious eyes. Captain, I called out, my tone shifting from executioner to proprietor. Could you step over here, please? The pilot, a seasoned aviation veteran, had looked at Richard, then at the federal agents, and finally at me. He wisely chose to comply with the woman backed by heavily armed law enforcement. He jogged over, stopping a respectful distance away. Yes, ma'am? The pilot asked, his voice tight with nerves. Harrison, my attorney, pulled a separate, brightly tabbed folder from his portfolio and handed it directly to the captain. Captain, you are currently contracted through Horizon Aviation Leasing out of Chicago, correct? I asked. Yes, ma'am, that's correct, he confirmed. Please review the document Mr. Harrison just handed you. It is a certified transfer of title and a federal repossession order. I instructed, my eyes remaining fixed on Richard to watch his reaction. The Sterling family defaulted on the lease payments for this aircraft 3 consecutive months ago. Horizon Aviation terminated the lease agreement late last night. I purchased the aircraft's title directly from them. The pilot rapidly scanned the legal document, his eyes widening as he read the signatures, the federal stamps, and the undeniable proof of ownership. He looked up, his expression a mix of shock and immediate professional compliance. Are you telling me this aircraft now belongs to Apex Financial? The pilot asked. I am, I confirmed. And as the sole proprietor of Apex Financial, I am giving you a direct order. The Sterling family is no longer authorized to board this aircraft. Their luggage is to be removed from the cargo hold immediately. This jet is grounded for them, effective this exact second. You can't do this, Richard had screamed, lunging forward, his fists balled in impotent rage. I paid for this charter, this is my plane. 2 federal agents had instantly stepped in front of me, their hands resting casually but purposefully on their tactical belts. Richard hit their solid wall of authority and bounced back, stumbling awkwardly on the tarmac. The pilot had turned to Richard, his demeanor shifting to cold professionalism. Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry, but I have to follow the legal title holder's instructions. You and your party are denied boarding. I will have the ground crew unload your baggage immediately. The sheer, unadulterated humiliation that washed over the Sterling family in that moment was breathtaking. They were grounded, stripped of their wings. The grand, boastful live stream Lauren had broadcast to the world was now the ultimate digital tombstone of their fake empire. They were stuck on the hot Atlanta tarmac, surrounded by the physical proof of their financial ruin, with nowhere to run and no money to hide behind. It was only minutes later that the federal cuffs had finally clicked around their wrists. I opened my eyes, the memory fading as the reality of the plush jet cabin came back into focus. I took a slow, deep sip of my sparkling water, the carbonation sharp and refreshing against my tongue. The federal vehicles were now just tiny specks in the distance, carrying my former tormentors to a destiny of metal bars and concrete cells. I reached over and pressed the intercom button on the polished wood console beside my seat. "Captain," I said, my voice steady and serene. "Yes, Ms. Zoya," the pilot's voice crackled through the speaker, crisp and deferential. "We are clear to proceed," I instructed. "Take us to New York. It's time to get to work." "Understood. Taxiing to the runway now. Next stop, Teterboro." I leaned back into the ivory leather, feeling the immense, thrilling thrust of the engines as the Gulfstream surged forward. I had stripped them of their wealth, their freedom, and their pride. The sky was clear, the runway was open, and I was finally truly flying. The sky was clear, the runway was open, and I was finally truly flying. Yet as the Gulfstream G650 banked smoothly through the clouds, climbing higher into the serene atmosphere, my mind anchored itself entirely to the exquisite perfection of what had just transpired on the sun-baked concrete below. The repossession of their beloved private jet had been a magnificent opening salvo, but the true victory, the absolute pinnacle of my carefully orchestrated retaliation, had unfolded mere minutes earlier on the tarmac. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, letting the cold carbonation wash over my tongue as I replayed the memory of their ultimate public collapse. It was a sequence of events so flawless it deserved to be savored frame by frame. Right after the pilot informed Richard Sr. that the aircraft was legally registered to Apex Financial and denied them boarding, a suffocating, paralyzing silence had descended over the group. The bluster and bravado completely drained from the patriarch, leaving him looking like a deflated balloon. But I was not finished. I turned my attention away from the sputtering old man and locked eyes directly with Lauren. She stood frozen in her designer travel ensemble, her manicured hand gripping her smartphone mid-air. She looked at Julian, expecting her billionaire prince to wave his hand and magically fix the situation, but Julian was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically, looking for an escape route that did not exist. "Lauren," I said, my voice cutting through the thick morning air with surgical precision. "You look confused. Allow me to provide some much-needed clarity regarding the man you are about to marry." I gestured to Harrison, my lead corporate litigator. He stepped forward and handed me a crisp-bound forensic report. I held it up so the bright Georgia sun illuminated the stark black text on the pages. "Julian promised you a billionaire dynasty, Lauren." I continued, walking closer to her, ensuring every single word landed with devastating, undeniable impact. "What he intentionally omitted is that he funded your entire fairy tale with stolen money. This report contains the certified digital metadata from Sterling Ventures, LLC. Your brilliant fiancé and his father illegally siphoned $12 million from their own employees' commercial pension funds. They routed the stolen cash through dummy construction companies and parked it in hidden offshore Cayman Island accounts." Lauren's mouth hung open. Her eyes darted wildly between me and the forensic report. She looked at Julian, demanding a furious denial, demanding he put me in my place. But Julian could not even meet her gaze. He was staring at the concrete, his shoulders trembling under his tailored suit. But Julian lacked the actual courage to put his own name on the fraudulent vendor contracts. I stated, my tone devoid of any pity. He needed a scapegoat. Instead of taking the risk himself, he mathematically duplicated my digital signature from our joint mortgage documents and pasted it onto every single piece of incriminating paperwork. He tried to frame me for a massive federal crime to finance your luxury lifestyle. Lauren physically recoiled, taking a sharp step backward. That massive 5-carat diamond currently sitting on your finger, I said, pointing directly at her hand. It was purchased with embezzled pension funds. The lavish engagement gala you have been relentlessly bragging about hosting at the Casino de Monte Carlo? The offshore accounts funding that spectacular event were permanently frozen by the federal government at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. Julian is not a billionaire heir, Lauren. He is a broke, desperate criminal who does not have a single legitimate cent to his name. You are not marrying into royalty. You are marrying a penniless felon. The horror that washed over Lauren's face was absolute. Her perfectly curated image, her meticulously planned social climb, her entire manufactured reality shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on the runway. The realization that she was standing next to a ruined, bankrupt fraudster hit her like a physical blow. She looked down at the massive diamond ring, her features twisting in pure, unfiltered revulsion. She ripped the ring off her finger, scraping her knuckle in her frantic haste. She threw the jewelry onto the tarmac, the precious stone bouncing unceremoniously against the rough concrete and rolling into a puddle of spilled champagne. "I am done with you," Lauren screamed at Julian, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You are disgusting! Do not ever speak to me again!" With the financial humiliation fully exposed, it was time for the final definitive strike. I stepped back, smoothing the front of my charcoal power suit, and nodded to Special Agent Marcus Thorne and RS Agent Sarah Jenkins. The line of heavily armed federal agents moved forward in perfect unison, their tactical boots striking the ground with a rhythmic, terrifying finality. They formed a tight, inescapable perimeter around the 3 Sterling men. Agent Thorne pulled a thick stack of warrants from his tactical vest. Richard Sterling Sr., Derek Sterling, and Julian Sterling Thorne announced, his voice booming with unyielding federal authority. "I hold federal arrest warrants issued by the United States Department of Justice. You are hereby under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, international money laundering, and the embezzlement of $12 million. The agents did not wait for a response. They swarmed the targets with absolute efficiency. Richard Sr. attempted to resist, puffing out his chest and demanding to speak to his high-powered defense attorneys. He shouted that he was a pillar of the Atlanta community and personal friends with the governor. The agents completely ignored his pathetic blustering, forcefully grabbing his arms and twisting them expertly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around the patriarch's wrists echoed across the silent runway, sounding like the closing of a heavy metal vault door. Derek proved to be an absolute unforgivable coward. The moment an IRS tactical agent grabbed the shoulder of his bespoke linen suit, Derek dropped entirely to his knees. He began sobbing uncontrollably, tears streaming down his perfectly tanned face. He threw his hands in the air, begging for a plea deal, loudly offering to testify against his own father and brother if the agents would just let him go home. He babbled frantically, shifting all the blame, pointing his trembling fingers at Julian and Richard Sr., completely betraying his bloodline in a desperate, pathetic bid for mercy. The agent simply hauled him to his feet, snapping the cuffs on him while he continued to weep. Julian stood completely paralyzed. The golden boy of Atlanta high society offered no resistance whatsoever as Agent Thorne personally cuffed him. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound terror and absolute disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer another empty apology or a pathetic plea for clemency, but the words entirely failed him. His arrogance was gone. His power was gone. He was shoved unceremoniously toward a waiting black SUV, his head pushed down by a federal agent to clear the doorframe. Amidst the utter chaos of the arrests, Vivian had completely lost her mind. The untouchable matriarch was hyperventilating her designer caftan, whipping wildly in the wind as she watched her husband and sons being treated like common street criminals. In a state of sheer, unadulterated panic, she fumbled with her smartphone, desperately trying to navigate her contacts to call her political connections, the mayor, the chief of police, anyone who could stop the destruction of her family. Her hands were shaking so violently that the sleek device slipped from her desperate grasp. It hit the tarmac with a sharp crack. But the phone did not break. Instead, as it hit the ground, her frantic tapping had accidentally activated her Instagram application and initiated a live broadcast directly to her massive digital social circle. The phone landed perfectly propped against a piece of abandoned custom Louis Vuitton luggage. The camera lens was angled flawlessly, capturing the entire panoramic view of the federal raid. Hundreds of Atlanta's most elite socialites, wealthy investors, rival real estate developers, and country club gossips immediately received the notification that Vivian Sterling was live. They tuned in by the thousands, fully expecting to see a glamorous champagne-fueled departure for Monaco. Instead, they were treated to a high-definition, unfiltered broadcast of their absolute ruin. They watched Richard Sr. being shoved roughly into a federal vehicle while screaming impotent obscenities. They watched Derek weeping on his knees, offering to sell out his family to save himself. They saw Julian, the disgraced, broke fiancé, being read his Miranda rights while Lauren shrieked at him in the background. The live chat feed on the broadcast exploded with a tidal wave of shocked comments, digital gasps, and ruthless mockery. The comments scrolled rapidly across the bottom of the screen, recording the immediate viral destruction of the Sterling family social standing. The elite facade was not just cracked, it was globally obliterated in real time for all their peers to witness. I remembered standing on the tarmac, looking down at the glowing screen of Vivian dropped phone, watching the live viewer count skyrocket into the tens of thousands. It was the perfect poetic end to their reign of cruelty and arrogance. They had wanted a spectacle, and I had given them a masterpiece. I took another sip of my sparkling water, gazing out the window as the jet leveled off at cruising altitude. The past was finally buried. Operation Monaco was a total undisputed success. I was no longer the quiet, submissive wife living in the shadow of a corrupt dynasty. I was the architect of their downfall and the sole owner of my future. The sky was boundless, and for the first time in my life, I held the controls. Even as I sat in the luxurious cabin looking out at the clouds, my thoughts drifted back to the final minutes on the ground. Just before I had turned to ascend the boarding stairs of my newly acquired jet, the full crushing reality of the situation had finally penetrated Julian's thick skull. The federal agents had been guiding him toward the armored transport vehicle, his hands secured tightly behind his back. He had looked at the gaping dark doorway of the SUV and realized that stepping inside meant the absolute end of his life as he knew it. It meant swapping silk sheets for a concrete slab. It meant the permanent eradication of Julian Sterling, the billionaire playboy. He panicked. With a sudden frantic burst of adrenaline, he dug the heels of his ruined designer shoes into the tarmac and threw his dead weight backward. The two federal agents, caught off guard by his sudden resistance, momentarily lost their forward momentum. Julian twisted his body and dropped entirely to his knees on the unforgiving, sun-baked concrete. The sharp impact tore straight through the expensive wool of his custom trousers, but he did not even flinch. He was completely consumed by a primal, consuming terror. He scrambled around on his knees, scraping his raw skin against the rough asphalt until he was facing me. He looked absolutely pathetic. His perfectly styled hair was plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. His face was blotchy and red, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Thick streaks of tears and mucus ran down his face, ruining his pristine features. The golden boy of Atlanta high society had been reduced to a groveling, weeping mess, right in front of the flight crew, the federal agents, and his completely silent, horrified parents. "Zoya, please wait!" Julian wailed, his voice cracking, pitching up into a hysterical shriek that echoed across the runway. "You cannot just leave me here. You cannot let them take me away. Please look at me, Zoya. It is me. It is Julian." I stopped at the base of the boarding stairs and turned slowly to look down at him. I did not say a word. I simply watched him exist in his perfectly earned misery. The smell of aviation fuel and hot asphalt hung heavy in the air, framing the absolute degradation of a man who had once believed he owned the world. My silence seemed to fuel his desperation. He began to drag himself toward me on his bleeding knees, his handcuffed arms rendering his movements awkward and worm-like. One of the federal agents stepped forward to grab him by the collar, but I raised a single hand. The agent paused, allowing the spectacle to unfold. I wanted to hear exactly what a broken narcissist sounded like when his entire world collapsed. I am sorry. Julian sobbed, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. I was wrong, Zoya. I was so wrong about you. You are brilliant. You are incredible. You outsmarted all of us. You beat my father. You beat Derek. You possess a genius that I never fully appreciated. I see it now. I see you now. He was trying to flatter me. He was reverting to the only tactic he knew, attempting to manipulate my emotions by offering the validation I had spent years desperately craving. But he was 3 years too late. His words were completely hollow, empty syllables falling from the lips of a cornered rat. He did not love me. He did not respect me. He only loved the salvation I currently represented. I know you have the money now, Julian begged, the true motivation behind his groveling finally rising to the surface. You bought the debt. You own the holding company. You have billions of dollars at your disposal, Zoya. You can fix this. You can pay them off. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country. You can bail us out. We can pay the fines and make all of this disappear quietly. Please, Zoya, we are married. We took vows. You are my wife. He was literally begging me to use the empire I had built to rescue him from the consequences of his own staggering greed. He was asking me to liquidate the assets I had painstakingly seized just to buy his freedom. The sheer audacity of his request was almost breathtaking. He wanted me to open my newly acquired checkbook and purchase his exoneration so he could go right back to living the lavish lifestyle he had stolen from innocent people. My father made me do it! Julian cried desperately, throwing Richard Sr. directly under the bus, just as Derek had done minutes earlier. It was his plan. The offshore accounts, the forged signatures, it was all his idea. He pressured me into it. He told me I had to do it to save the family legacy. I never wanted to hurt you, Zoya. I never wanted to frame you. He forced my hand. You have to believe me. I was just trying to be a good son. Richard Sr., sitting handcuffed in the back of an SUV, let out a muffled roar of outrage against the reinforced glass, but Julian ignored him entirely. Julian was fighting for his life, and he was willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone to save his own skin. He had no loyalty to his father, no loyalty to his brother, and certainly no loyalty to me. We can start over, Julian pleaded, leaning forward as far as his restrained arms would allow. We can take your new wealth and we can build a real life together. A better life. I will leave Lauren. I already hate her. You saw how quickly she turned on me. She means nothing to me. You are the only woman I have ever truly loved. We are family. We have to stick together in times of crisis. You have to show some family forgiveness. Please, Zoya. I am begging you for family forgiveness. Family forgiveness. The phrase hung in the thick, humid air like a foul stench. It was a weapon they had used against me for years. Whenever they insulted me, undermined me, or excluded me, they always demanded family forgiveness. They demanded that I turn the other cheek, that I swallow my pride, and accept their cruelty because we were supposedly a family. They used the concept of family as a shield to protect themselves from accountability. I looked down at the man kneeling on the tarmac. I analyzed his tear-stained face, his ruined suit, his desperate bloodshot eyes. I searched my own heart, looking for even a microscopic trace of the love I had once felt for him. I looked for a flicker of pity, a shred of sympathy, or even a spark of residual anger. There was absolutely nothing. I felt an absolute zero empathy. My emotional core was a fortress of solid ice. I was completely clinically detached. I was observing him with the same dispassionate interest one might use to study a dying insect on the pavement. He was no longer my husband. He was no longer my oppressor. He was simply a highly leveraged asset that I had successfully liquidated and discarded. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The federal agents tensed, but I only moved close enough to ensure that my voice would carry directly to his ears and nowhere else. I looked down at him, my expression totally blank, my posture radiating unyielding iron authority. Family, forgiveness. I repeated the words rolling off my tongue like chilled poison. That is a fascinating concept, Julian. Truly fascinating. Julian nodded frantically, a pathetic glimmer of hope sparking in his desperate eyes. Yes, Zoya. Family forgiveness. We are a family. We can heal from this. I promise I will make it up to you every single day for the rest of my life. I tilted my head slightly, studying his pathetic, hopeful expression. I allowed the silence to stretch, letting him dangle by a thread over the abyss. I savored the absolute power I held over his existence. I let him believe for one fraction of a second that his manipulation had worked, that the quiet, submissive wife was going to step in and clean up his mess one last time. Then, with surgical precision, I delivered the final, ultimate payoff. You spent the last 3 years reminding me every single day that I did not belong in your elite world. I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that stripped away the last remaining shreds of his hope. You allowed your mother to mock me. You allowed your brother to insult me. You allowed your father to treat me like an invisible servant. You replaced me with a politician daughter because you needed a proper society wife to parade around your country clubs. You stole from your own employees, and you forged my signature to ensure I would rot in a federal prison while you sipped champagne on a yacht in the Mediterranean. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his terrified eyes, ensuring he could see the absolute void where my affection for him used to reside. You said it yourself, I stated, delivering the iron boundary with crushing, unshakable finality. I am not part of this family, and strangers do not pay each other debts. The impact of my words was instantaneous and absolute. The tiny spark of hope in Julian's eyes was permanently extinguished. His face crumpled, collapsing inward as the total weight of his inescapable reality finally crashed down upon him. He realized in that exact moment that there was no manipulation left to employ, no charm left to weaponize, and no money left to steal. He was entirely, totally alone, facing the absolute ruin he had constructed with his own 2 hands. Julian let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure despair. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the rough, oil-stained concrete of the tarmac. He sobbed uncontrollably, his body shaking with the violent tremors of a man who had just watched his entire universe burn to ash. I did not stay to watch him weep. I did not offer a second glance. I turned my back on the pathetic, ruined man on the ground and walked away. I climbed the boarding stairs of the Gulfstream G65, my heels clicking rhythmically against the metal steps. I reached the top landing and stepped into the luxurious cabin without a single backward glance. The heavy cabin door closed behind me, sealing the Sterling family outside in the sweltering heat of their own destruction. That was the memory that played in my mind as the jet climbed higher into the limitless sky. The groveling, the pathetic pleas, the ultimate assertion of my iron boundary. It was the perfect conclusion to a flawlessly executed strategy. I had not just defeated them, I had completely eradicated their power over me. I took another sip of my sparkling water, feeling the cool liquid soothe my throat. The past was dead and buried on that Atlanta tarmac. The future belonged entirely to me. The past was dead and buried on that Atlanta tarmac. The future belonged entirely to me. As the Gulfstream jet banked sharply and climbed through the dense cloud cover, I looked down at the shrinking landscape one final time. Even over the powerful roar of the ascending Rolls-Royce engines, my memory retained the fading echo of the federal sirens wailing across the airfield. I remembered the exact pitch of Vivian's hysterical screams begging for a mercy she had never once extended to anyone else. I had turned my back and walked up the boarding stairs without breaking my stride, completely ignoring her manic theatrics. I had left them exactly where they belonged, standing in the smoldering ashes of their own deceit. The flight to Teterboro Airport was spectacularly peaceful. I spent those quiet hours organizing my acquisition files and preparing the ruthless liquidation strategy that awaited the Sterling assets. There was absolutely no hesitation left in my heart. 6 months later, the sprawling, magnificent skyline of Manhattan stretched out before me, forming a jagged horizon of glass and steel that perfectly matched my new reality. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my corner office at Apex Financial, located on the 60th floor of a premier Hudson Yards high-rise. The space was deliberately minimalist, featuring clean architectural lines, dark polished walnut, and brushed steel surfaces. There were no gaudy crystal chandeliers, no heavy velvet drapes, and absolutely no faux aristocratic oil paintings. Every single item in this office had been earned through sheer intellect and relentless, grueling labor. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, relishing the quiet, unyielding authority that commanded the room. My executive assistant knocked briskly before entering, carrying a thick leather-bound portfolio. She placed it squarely on my desk with a respectful professional nod and quietly exited, closing the heavy glass door behind her. I walked over to the desk, running my hand over the embossed cover before letting my mind drift to the news alerts that had dominated the financial sector's morning briefing. The federal court proceedings in Georgia had officially concluded yesterday afternoon, delivering absolute, unmitigated justice. The Sterling men had collapsed under the immense, crushing pressure of the federal government, exactly as my algorithms had predicted. Derek, terrified of spending a decade in a medium-security prison, had immediately turned state evidence against his father and brother. Julian had retaliated by attempting to blame the entire embezzlement scheme on Derek and Richard Sr. The resulting legal bloodbath was a spectacular, highly publicized implosion. The federal judge showed zero leniency, citing their egregious breach of fiduciary duty. Richard Sr. was sentenced to 15 years, his arrogant bluster permanently silenced by the harsh, concrete reality of a federal penitentiary. Derek and Julian each received 12 years, without the possibility of early parole. Their elite country club memberships were permanently replaced by standardized inmate numbers. The financial devastation I wrought was even more absolute. As their primary secured creditor, I had ruthlessly and systematically liquidated their entire fake empire. The sprawling Buckhead estate, with its ridiculous imported marble columns and pristine lawns, was auctioned off to a commercial developer who planned to raze it to the ground and build luxury condominiums. Their fleet of leased luxury cars was repossessed and sold to cover the outstanding bridge loans. Vivian, stripped of her wealth and her stolen social standing, was forced to move into a tiny two-bedroom apartment in a distinctly unremarkable suburb. Her high society friends abandoned her the exact moment the scandal hit, treating her like a highly contagious disease. Lauren had vanished, completely changing her phone number and fleeing the state to escape the radioactive blast radius of the Sterling name. The dynasty was completely eradicated, wiped from the map of Atlanta elite circles, leaving behind nothing but cautionary tales and bankrupt ledgers. I opened the leather portfolio on my desk, shifting my focus away from their total destruction and toward my own creation. Inside the portfolio rested the finalized contract for the Apex Financial Empowerment Initiative. It was a comprehensive, legally binding, multi-million-dollar grant program that I had personally designed and independently funded. The initiative was structured to provide massive, unrestricted venture capital and full-ride academic scholarships to young African American women pursuing advanced degrees in forensic accounting, artificial intelligence, and corporate finance. I picked up my heavy platinum fountain pen, feeling its comforting solid weight in my hand. For years, the Sterlings had tried to convince me that I was a worthless outsider. They had demanded that I shrink myself to fit into their shallow, restrictive molds. They had weaponized their fake wealth to enforce compliance and demand a respect they had never actually earned. I was signing this document to ensure that the next generation of brilliant women would never have to endure that kind of degradation. I wanted to build an impenetrable financial fortress for women who possessed the vision and the intellect to shift global markets, but lacked the initial capital to break through systemic barriers. I was bypassing the traditional gatekeepers and handing the keys directly to the innovators. I pressed the pen to the heavy parchment paper and signed my name with bold, decisive strokes. With that single signature, I transferred $10 million of liquidated Sterling assets directly into the Empowerment Fund. I was actively transforming their stolen, toxic wealth into a foundation of genuine, lasting opportunity. True value does not come from inherited country club memberships, forced societal validation, or the desperate approval of hollow people. True value comes from absolute independence. It comes from possessing the relentless vision to see through the illusions of the world and the raw, unapologetic power to build your own reality. I closed the portfolio and walked back to the window, looking out over the sprawling city. The morning sun reflected off the Hudson River, turning the water into a ribbon of blinding gold. The painful years of submissive silence were a distant memory. The fraudulent empire I had dismantled was reduced to dust. From those ashes, I had forged an undeniable legacy. I was the architect, I was the apex, and my reign was just beginning.